Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome back to Shelf Stories, a channel to tell tales from games, books, and life. And also welcome to the One Stop Co-op Shop podcast. I am your host, Jason. Thank you so much for stopping by for this latest industry nuts and bolts. I have been doing industry nuts and bolts for a while now. I need a new name for it. It's a new year, so we're going to reorg some things. And the reason I'm wanting to section this off as a particular topic in this area is because, we're going to dive in. We're going to get specific. And, I think there's a lot of people who have questions like, what does it really look like? To be a designer, to be a publisher, to actually make these games appear on the table. So that is what is going to be the focus of this mini series. And this person right here served up a good piece of content, doing all the work for Jason here at Shelf Stories. I really appreciate it. And it was so interesting that I reached out to the person almost immediately, and they were so great. So this is Matthew Dunstan. He is a designer. He'll tell you all about his games in just a second. He put up a tweet thread about the actual nuts and bolts, the finances that go into being an independent game designer. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about advances and royalties and how that all looks like in a general way. We don't going to specify, all the contractual stuff, but we've gone over it and we are so happy to share it with you. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring in Matthew Dunstan, designer extraordinaire. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thanks very much for having me on, and very kind introduction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but before let's get started and talk about you as a person and some of the games that we're going to talk about today. So on our show, we are the solo co-op focus. So we know the adventure games, and we've covered them multiple times, and they've gone on. So like they first came out, I think, 2018, somewhere around there.
2019, I think.
2019. Okay. And then so then they have kept on going, and we're very familiar with them, but maybe introduce us to some of the other games with which we might be familiar, like Chocolate Factory or Echo series. Tell us all about that.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Matthew Dunstan. I'm originally Australian, although I currently live in the Czech Republic, and I designed most of the games when I lived in the UK, which I've done for the most of the last 10 years.
What brought you away from Australia to the UK or to EU, if I could ask?
Yeah, I went to Cambridge to do my PhD in chemistry in 2011.
Wow.
And I'm now currently in the Czech Republic because my fiance is Czech, and we've been traveling between the two, between the UK and the Czech Republic for most of those 10 years. So yeah, it's just I've been here since the start of all these things happening a few years ago. But it's been a nice place to be, and a very good place to be a game designer generally. That's part of I guess my success and my ability to make so many games has been the proximity to conventions. I got to go to Essen for the first time in 2011, so over 10 years ago, and I've pitched games probably for about 10 years consecutively at Essen. So that's a huge benefit, and there's a lot of other fairs and things. And also, seeing as you are a sort of solo co-op, podcast or channel, I see Roll for Adventure on the shelf behind you, actually, Jason. So that's another one from Cosmos, like the adventure games. I also did Professor Evil and the Citadel of Time, which is a cooperative. Somewhere. Oh, there we go.
I love this game.
There you go.
I think this game is fantastic.
I'm glad. Not planned. I'll have to. If you haven't got the expansion, I'll have to send you the expansion, Jason.
Is it the Architects of Magic?
It is. I don't know how available it is, so I
got it. No. I good. This is. It's so funny because you're a co-designer. We'll talk about the co-design stuff in a second, so I don't automatically associate Matthew Dunstan with these things. It's if it's two names for whatever reason, unless it's like Hans and Gluck or whatever, it doesn't. But anyway, wow, this is a lot of games. I think Roll for Adventure is a truly underrated gem. Like, it's so easy to play, and my kid gets into it. It's very we've reviewed it on the podcast, and Professor Evil is a heist game. And there's not a lot of heist games out there that are good, especially in the cooperative space. I'm sitting there with Burgle Brothers, so of course I like heist games. And I mean, Professor Evil is a magnificent game. It's we try the best that we can to keep these games in print and get the word out about them. And but yeah,
any
awesome.
Small world, any word is very appreciated, and I'm very happy with how they turned out as well.
Excellent.
Yes,
both
those
excellent.
games
Fantastic
Yeah,
games.
both of those are co-designed with Brett Gilbert, so I should make sure. And the adventure games, which you mentioned with Phil Walker Harding, and the Echoes games, which are also sort of cooperative narrative games, and those are with Dave Neal of sort of Sherlock Holmes consulting detective fame.
So tell us about the Echo series, because I don't those ones I don't think we've covered.
Yeah, so the Echo series were just released in 2021 from Ravensburger. They're audio mystery games. So in the box, you'll get 24 cards, and you're trying to recreate a story or the events that have occurred in a particular mystery. And each object, you have the power to hear the memories of an object, of like what was happening around that object in the story. And you do that you have an app on your phone that uses automatic recognition to scan the card and then automatically play the sound to do with that card. And you basically just have to put those objects in the right order, and how they kind of occurred in the story. And as you do that, you're going to uncover more and more audio clips, which will give you more and more details about what actually went on. And that's basically the game. There's 2 boxes out already in English called The Dancer and The Cocktail, and soon the Microchip will join it. But that's like the adventure games. We're hoping it's going to be a series that goes on for a little bit longer.
All right. No, we got to take a look. Thank you for lighting up. And also Chocolate Factory. We're going to talk about Chocolate Factory. That'll come up on the pie chart. Previewing for the peoples, there's a pie chart coming, people. So if you listen to the podcast, there's a very exciting pie chart coming that you're going to miss. Hop over to the video shelf stories. You will see this excellent pie chart. So then just, very briefly, because I know that also is a pretty significant contributor to your yearly income.
Yeah, no, Chocolate Factory did really well. It's not a cooperative game, another game co-designed with Brett Gilbert. No, but it was just really well received, and it's a Kickstarter game that has continued to sell somewhat. After the initial Kickstarter, which doesn't always happen. Usually, you assume kind of the majority of your sales are going to be from the Kickstarter, but no, it has had a little bit more of life, which is always nice.
All right, so now we're going to get into it. We are going to get into the nuts and bolts of how Matthew Dunstan has puts games on the table, and we're getting into the numbers. But I'm going to save the numbers for a little bit. We're going to save the entree for last. Let's get into the appetizers. So you are a full-time designer, right? Do you use your PhD, or is that PhD just kind of like sitting there?
So the story is, I'm only just from the start of this year, 2022, am I officially full-time. For the last year, basically all of 2021, I was officially part-time. So I was 50% at my previous job, which I did use my PhD for. I was a research scientist still at the University of Cambridge. And then the preceding kind of 9 years, which was my PhD, and working afterwards, I was just designing, not as a hobby. I was making money from it, but I had a full-time job as well. So it's been a sort of a progression over those 10 or 12 years to where I am today as a full-time designer.
Is that a difficult thing? Because a PhD is no joke. Like, you have to really sink in a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of expertise, and to have like a life like that, built around a PhD. I did not go the PhD route. I am so, I'm like, wow. Cause I have 2 master's degrees, and both times I'm looking at it, the end of the road and going, nah, I don't want that. Cause it's a lot of work and a lot of time in the library or in the research lab or writing or whatever it is. So then, just kind of walk through briefly that decision to say, you know what, I went so far down this road, so much investment, I still want to do this other thing. Maybe walk us through that mindset.
Wow, that's almost another podcast in itself, because it's a slightly complicated story with me. Essentially, because my life is sort of split up between 3 countries. All my family is in Australia, my job and my kind of career was in the UK, and my fiance was in the Czech Republic. And the one thing about academia that is very difficult is kind of choosing where you get to live or where you get to work. And so actually there's decisions that were made on a sort of a personal level, and there's also sort of on the professional side, they're kind of intertwined. You maybe have to make different professional decisions because of those personal ones. And I think the other thing that's kind of maybe important in that is that I guess the hardest thing for me was not necessarily to go into full-time game design. I think that made sense because financially actually did make sense. And I was already kind of doing it anyway, almost full-time. But I think the thing I've actually struggled with is sort of an idea of identity, because you're right. A PhD is a big thing, but even more than that, it's like when somebody asks you at a party, like, what do you do? And I'd always say, I was a research scientist, or I work on this, or I work on, renewable energy kind of technologies and things. And to suddenly, actually, that's the harder part, actually, the change in identity than is an actual change in like a job or a day-to-day, or I'm actually going to still be working a little bit with my old lab and helping some folks. But it's that kind of change of, actually now, I am a full-time game designer. That is and I know identity is so complicated that it's not just what you do, but that's the thing I'm probably getting most used to, I guess.
Sure. I mean, people react differently because then, I don't know if you've ever had the experience, but, I'm starting to transition more into the, content and all that kind of thing, and like explaining to people, and that initial kind of barrier, and you hit the preconceptions of what games are. And it's like, oh, frivolous thing, or, oh, really, that kind of thing. And I guess like, research scientists, that's all baked in. It's like, they don't give that away. Then you go to this other thing where sometimes it's like active resistance. Sometimes it's just like, oh, well, you have to explain stuff, but there's still kind of a friction there. So, I mean, is that, just kind of part of the deal that you've accepted?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, mostly when I tell people I design games, they're just really enthusiastic, or actually just very curious in a kind of positive way, that they just want to, they know board games, they kind of want to know what's behind it. They don't necessarily assume that even there was someone behind board games necessarily. I think they see companies and they don't think of designers necessarily.
Interesting.
Yeah, but there is a bit of it's even an internal thing with me. It was always easy when I would say what I did. I'm like, I worked on, in the lab I worked on, we worked on making advances in batteries, so it's always very easy to go like, I'm making a real difference in the world. I'm kind of trying to help with renewable energy and technologies, and it's a bit of a harder ask when it comes to games. I think games are incredibly important, and I think they have a place in culture that that can have a real benefit to society. But it's not as easy as a link than saying, I'm working on the next battery that you might be able to put in your electric car, kind of thing. So yeah, I'm getting used to that. But to be honest, I haven't really, it's just positive curiosity from people, which has been really nice.
Fantastic. So then, you are a full-time designer. Having the organization to kind of, do it well, because it could get away from you pretty quickly. It's like, I'm on my own, so I can work 80 hours if I want to. So, I mean, what do you have in place to get an optimal flow of output as an independent designer?
Yeah, I mean, that's I should come back on the show in about a year. I'll have all the systems set up by then properly, because I'm probably still to be absolutely honest. I mean, right, like the last 2 years, I think, as for a lot of people, have been these kind of years of not transition, but have been transitory in some way, in that things have changed. For me, I went from working in an office that I've been working at home in a different country that I was living in that I was before, and sharing an apartment and all these sort of things. So I'm not sure if I really have the system worked out. I'll be honest. I kind of want to, I don't think, I'm not sure what the myth is around game creation, but I think you have to find what works. It's not going to be the same for everybody, and I think it's just basically, it's always meeting the minimum amount to keep things going. I always think about, being a game designer is managing lots of projects. It's project management, basically. You're dealing with, X number of plates spinning, and you're just trying to make sure that each of them are moving ahead, or that at least you're not the person who's stopping them moving ahead. There's a lot of, the other thing about game designers is you're not in control of a lot of things. Ultimately, you're always working with other people, even if you're a solo designer on a game. To actually get that game released, unless if you're going to self-publish it or whatever, but you're going to be working with publishers and developers and sometimes media, or you're working with a lot of other people to kind of do that job, and much like other jobs as well. So there's a lot of time even where you're just got to keep track of, like, is it in my court or is it in somebody else's court? And okay, then I don't have to worry about it. So I'm always about just hitting those minimums, and then it's just about keeping good track of what you need to be doing. And I mean, as horrible as it is, it's just like keeping on top of emails and things like that. I mean, I think it's those basic things which I got very used to in my PhD, that you have to be pretty reasonable at it, academia. So, and again, it's not a unique skill to that either. A lot of professions and things need to do that. So I don't think it's anything particular.
How many games at once are you working on?
Well, if I count sort of projects that are in any stage up to the box being released, it would be in the 20s, I think, probably. But again, my point is that some number of those are I don't have to actively work on them. They're maybe sitting with a publisher, they're doing work on them, or we're waiting for the boat to come to deliver the games, or I've sent a prototype to a publisher, now they're considering it, and I tend not to work actively on a game when publishers are considering it, because it just sort of, if they come back with feedback and I've already changed something, that might be a bit weird. So in terms of games which I'm really actively working on, it's probably in the 10 to 15 range, I guess. And then, there's another 10 or 15, which are kind of, like waiting a publication, or I'm waiting back on various things.
You mentioned, we've talked about co-design before. I think basically all your stuff is co-designed, is that, or at least the published stuff, is that correct? Or
pretty much. I've got a few there. So probably the biggest solo one is called Monumental, which was also with Funforge. It was a big sort of Kickstarter minis sort of game. So I've got a few solo designs, but yeah, like 90% of my games are co-designed basically, and a lot with one, Brett Gilbert. I've done probably half of my collaborations have been with him, I would say.
So then how do you, because you had mentioned in the thread, and I do recommend the Twitter thread, please give your Twitter handle. The Wise Owl or something.
I'm at Wise Goldfish. All one
there you
word.
Go, Wise Goldfish. Even worse.
I should have.
Even weirder.
It was from this time of like putting I was like funky chicken. So we're on BGG. I'm happy squid. It's just. I just, and of course, like I didn't perceive where the internet would go, where realistically having one name everywhere and a name that makes some amount of sense would be useful. But oh well, I'm stuck with it now, so
that's fine. Too many followers change. So in the Twitter thread that you had mentioned that you recommend that process, like you can get more money and more productivity out of multiple co-designs rather than kind of doing it solo. And I imagine that's going to be to taste, like, different people are going to have different personalities, but that's a road that is open where it's like somebody might see a co-design and be like, okay, I got to split half the money. I got to, kind of do whatever. But then you found that you were more productive and therefore more money coming in. It's one of the things you mentioned.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think you solve problems a lot more quickly. Like in a way, game design is just solving a series of problems. The game doesn't work, solve the first problem. Okay, now there's another problem. And usually when you have more people working on a single problem, more people are suggesting different answers, and you're more likely to get to the right one eventually. I think the other thing with that I think about with game design in a sort of like zooming out slightly, I think of it as kind of throwing darts at a board. If you're thinking of it in terms of how to be financially successful or financially sustainable, you'll try every time you release a game, you're kind of throwing a dart at the dartboard, and that's a chance. You don't know what dollar value you're going to get from that game necessarily. Like a lot of things are out of control. How will it be received? Blah 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 blah. But if you take more shots at the dartboard, you've got a better chance to get the bullseye, so to speak, which is kind of an evergreen game, a game that will sell over and over again. And having 50% of a game that sells every year is like still way better than having 100% of a game that only sold for 3 months. And of course, it's not perfect, but I err on the side of having more shots at that dartboard, to get, because you only need one or two things to do really well, even as a co-designer, as we'll get into the numbers later, and that can be sustainable effectively.
How do you go about choosing a co-designer?
There's a strict audition process, and no, I just like working with other people. I think and there's a lot of people I even start co-designs with, and maybe they don't go anywhere. Sometimes I'm always happy to try working with people. Sometimes I admire some things they've done previously, and I reach out to them. Sometimes, a lot of the early things, we're all part of a group in Cambridge, a playtesting group. There's other folks like David Thompson and Trevor Benjamin. So, Undaunted, for example, is a very popular game from them. And Brett and Chris Marling, and that whole group of us, and we playtested together. And over that time, we started sort of like designing together, and you'd split off. So there's an interesting map of, like X has done a game with Y, and Y has done a game with Z, and Z's done a game with X. And so it's just very natural, and it was just, quite social, I would say. Now it's a little bit more, I have to be a bit more outgoing, because obviously it's not as much chance to meet people sort of incidentally.
All right.
And sometimes when I have a new idea, I will know that it requires a certain skill set that I think will make sense. A really good example of this is I'm making more and more narrative games, a bit like the adventure games and Echoes. And Dave Neal is basically I think probably, if not the best, top 3 narrative tabletop game designers in the world, I would say personally. I think he's amazing, and I know that if I want to make a game like that, I can make it with like Dave. It will just be better. Like there's no doubt about it. And ultimately, I want to make better games, and also working with Dave will probably make the process easier and quicker as well. So it's a win-win basically.
So mind that playtesting group, people. And I know that's a little bit tough nowadays, but like that's a good place to start in terms of, because what I'm hearing is if game design is a exercise in problem solving, like you want to find a simpatico problem solver, and
Absolutely.
that playtesting group is a place to really hash that out, and stuff emerges from there.
And I think being open to hearing answers, I obviously there's a difference between a playtester giving suggestions and then like a designer coming on board. There's some graduation there, but I think if you approach your playtesting group and in playtesting in general, game designing in general, in an open way, with the idea that you don't have to own everything, that other people can have very useful ideas, and actually that even bringing people on even further in terms of co-designing can be really, really valuable. I don't know how many. It's interesting. I think folks have very different approaches to game design, and some don't even consider it. And I'll just say to those people who haven't considered game design, do so, and sometimes just being a bit more open and not so worried. You have to. It requires you to kind of hold your ideas a little less close to your chest, because you have to kind of share them with someone else, and that other person might not completely agree with what you would have done with the game, but you have to kind of share that and kind of hold it together to go forward and to get it finished. And it definitely takes some practice to get good at that, but I think everyone can do it. And I just say that that's something maybe to keep in mind if you've never thought about it or have struggled in the past to kind of get that fit or to kind of get that working, that might be something to think about.
All right. So I've let the people wait long enough. They want to see some of the numbers. Let's get into some of the numbers. And by the way, I want to thank Isaac Shalev, who gave me some great questions and some great stuff to think about. Hopefully, going to have Isaac on the show one of these days. So, okay, let's talk about, we're going to do the pie chart, right? I think, is that a good place to start in terms of,
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the, hopefully you can see the screen.
Yep.
I mean, this is the sort of the headline figure, I guess. I didn't know whether you wanted to have the end figure, but maybe it's a bit easier to have a figure in mind from the start.
Okay, so then for the benefit of the podcast listeners, we are sharing a screen with some concrete numbers. And I'll do my best to translate because it's in euros, I believe. And then let's see what that conversion is in dollars.
I could do a super quick. I've got my other thing open in my.
Okay, super quick. There you go. I like super quick.
That will work. Okay, so basically this is looking at my total royalties for 2021, and from royalties. So this doesn't include advances. So these are only from games that have already been released. This is from a total of 14 separate games or series. I counted the adventure games all as one, and Echoes, for example, are all as one. And that comes out to about just under 45,000 euros, and that's about 51,000 US dollars. Mm-hmm. And I also did a few other small things, like I did a bit of development, but actually that's a very, very small amount of the total thing. And then with advances, I got about 10,000 euros in the year, which is about a bit over 11,000 US dollars. So that's advances for games that haven't been released yet. And again, I should note, which I should have said with all of this, as we've been talking with co-design, most of this is 50% of the total amount that would have been paid because I get half of my co-design. So, when I say...
This is after the divisions and everything.
Exactly. So when I say I get 10,000 euros from advances, in reality, the total from the games is like 20,000 euros, but I got half, sort of thing.
Right.
And so that gives a total of about just under 55,000 euros for the year, which is about 62,000 US dollars for an income. So actually again, I don't know in the US, that's actually a pretty good wage, to be honest. Sure. Certainly in the Czech Republic, it's very good. But even the UK, it's more than what I would have earned in my previous job. So
I mean, in America, it totally depends on where you are. Like if you are, I mean, there's cities in America where, say $60,000 will actually do you really, really good. And then there's cities in America where you're going to have to just like scrimp and scrape, and like I actually moved out of New York City. I'm from New York City. and I had to move out because I was making $60,000 and it was not enough. You know, it was a 1-bedroom apartment. I was paying about $2,000 a month for it, US.
Oh gosh.
And you know, the numbers just don't add up when you're making that the level of income. So actually, before we go into the nuts and bolts, describe, like, talking about numbers just gives you the feel sometimes, right? It's because it's like almost like a dirty secret. You know, people just don't like talking about these numbers. And, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, if I'm making too much, then I want to, you know, cheese people off. We're making a little bit less. Or if I'm making like less, I don't want to, you know, embarrass myself, blah, blah, blah. So there's so much psychological stuff that goes into being this transparent. So that's another reason that your thread leapt out to me. So just talk a little bit about those feelings for you and why you thought it was so important to be transparent with the numbers, despite that maybe emotional barrier.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, just talking about money generally is sort of a, you know, not forbidden, but it's a sort of taboo subject. I think it's interesting because even before I did this Twitter thread, I put out a different tweet which said, you know, I know everyone's been doing it tough this couple of last year. I mean, in particular, you sort of, you know, especially on Twitter, you know, there's a lot of, quite understandably, a lot of difficulty, a lot of struggle for a lot of different reasons, but it's probably a bit more than normal because of what we've had over the last few years. But so I was like, do people want to hear about this, knowing that I've had a good year actually, like, but I'm aware of other people in the industry that are struggling, you know, and that's not really any fault of their own. So, you know, there's a bit of a sense that, yeah, what you said, you don't want to, it's not about putting people off, but it was more about, I like to think about what I put on Twitter when I can is trying to help designers and help people, you know, design games and do it as a profession. And that in the end was what drove me to, like, that's why I should do this, regardless of all these other kind of feelings that, and I mean, as it was born out, it was quite positively received. And I think it you know, it was useful to a lot of people. I actually did do it last year as well. I used to stream, and I didn't do it on Twitter. I did it on stream. So I have the same numbers from last year, which are actually about the same. It turns out, of course, it probably is better I did put it on Twitter because I have more people following me on Twitter. But yeah, I tend to do it. And I had some really good examples from other folks in the industry. There's a person called Arnold Rowers who runs a digital studio called Tiny Touch Tales. I hope that's right. He makes app games. So some folks might know Card Crawl or Card Thief. These really, really amazing app games. And actually, he's one of the people I reached out over the internet to say, can we design something together? And we'll have an app coming out next year. But nice. He, for a very long time, has done a yearly blog post where he basically puts the graph of his sales, you know, because with apps, you know, you get kind of an output or like a dashboard of, you know, these were the sales each month or whatever. And it's really just like, there are the numbers, bam. I mean, he has a slightly more freedom, I guess, because he is the publisher and he is, you know, the kind of sole person. And so he can make that decision to even give the most granular numbers. I have to step back. You know, you notice that I always give kind of the total. I don't go like game X made this exact amount of money because I think a lot of publishers wouldn't mind me sharing the numbers, but it is some amount of, you know, kind of like, it's not proprietary knowledge, but it's, you know, like sales figures, you know, like, you know, it's, I think I want to leave it up to the publishers if they want to share those specifically, but I just try and give an overall picture. I talk about, you know, advance rates, for example, and I talk about, you know, I had one contract with this amount, and, you know, X contracts with this amount, but I don't name names. Maybe that would be useful. I think I was actually having a conversation a bit earlier the other day with another designer. The problem with I think it's much more a problem with bad publishers. You know, you would, in some ways, you would love to be able to tell designers, don't work with these publishers because they're problematic.
They'll stiff you. they'll lowball you.
It's well, there's a lot of problems. Unfortunately, I mean, you know, the industry is still kind of maturing in a way, and there's always going to be independent publishers and things like that, and that's great. I haven't found the way to be specific in a public way when it needs to, and that's something I want to keep working on because I think it is useful. I haven't quite found the balance. I don't know where it is to, you know, because sometimes you do have to be specific. Sometimes you do actually have to say, you know what, like, because I am in a position of power, I could say that about a publisher, and and I won't face, I'll still be okay basically, but maybe that publisher, that designer's whose first game or something, they don't have that kind of power. That being said, there are some other famous examples of other designers who have done that, especially in ways which I think are not helpful, or in situations which are a little bit more murky. So yeah, anyway, that's okay. A slight side tangent, but I'm still working on that.
That's okay. I mean, let's go into the breakdown.
Yeah, so
where the stream comes from.
Yeah, so this is the pie chart. So as you can see, it's 60% from the adventure games, basically. I mean, partly that's because at this point there are 6 different. Sorry, from these royalties, there were 4 different titles. I think there are now 6. There were 2 more released last year that I haven't received royalties on yet, and those are in a lot of different languages. They sell mostly in German, but the English copies in the US and UK are quite significant, and there's some French and other languages that have actually been into I don't know how many, probably 8 or 9 languages now. And so that is it's it's a large chunk of change. But going back to kind of the psychological thing, is once you get I'm not sure if I would necessarily call the adventure games evergreens yet. They're somewhere in between, because this new model where you have these array of games where you release regular content, it's somewhere in between evergreen and almost like a subscription or a magazine which comes out with which comes out with new content regularly, and you can, if you have a kind of enfranchised audience, they'll keep buying it, so it kind of can sell regularly. And that's what we have with the adventure games, and that's another thing to think that's sort of more open, I think, now. Designers, when you're thinking about trying to get an evergreen title, there are different ways to do that now that I think probably didn't exist maybe 5 or even 3 years ago. Patreon and Kickstarter, like people like Button Shy have kind of shown that, like, these kind of more subscription models or content releases, there's new ways to kind of build a regular income base. And that money from the adventure games, because that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years now, that gave me some degree of confidence that, like, okay, this is kind of like, if everything else goes terribly, like if I don't sell any of my old games, if they all go to 0, if I don't sign any other new games, I will have this kind of like baseline income. And yeah, it's not like that by itself is not quite enough to live on, but there is kind of a basic level that I'd be okay. And also I knew when I made that decision to go full time, I had X number of games which I knew were going to be released, that I had a reasonable confidence that they'd also make some money. So that is the thing that kind of really enables everything. And then after that, you can see it really drops off, quite quickly in a way. So Chocolate Factory is about 14%. Actually, these numbers are slightly the accounting with Chocolate Factory, nothing to do with the publisher, was all to do with my problem. Another note to anybody who wants to be independent: don't try and be a citizen of one country who works in another country, who is a tax resident in a third country, because your taxes get very, very complicated very quickly. So there was a little bit of accounting stuff that probably meant that this year I got more of Chocolate Factory. It got spread out longer, basically, is my point.
Right.
Which is fine. And then Echoes is 10%. And actually that was, I mean, just to to give an idea of things like these big box stores, that money is purely from the pre-sales to Target in the US and to Thalia, which is a sort of a big box book chain in Germany. It's like one of the big, I don't know, like Borders, I guess, in something like that. Or I don't know, maybe does Borders exist anymore? I don't know.
No, we're gone with Borders.
Okay, I'm out of the. But anyway, so that's only pre-sales of that game. So that also shows kind of how much these big box stores, order. Before anything happens, that doesn't happen with other games. So that really helped with Echoes as well.
So you had mentioned before, like a range of like 6 to 8% in terms of a designer royalty.
So this is for the contracts. So
yes.
In the thread, I don't have a slide for it, I'm afraid, but in the thread, I have signed 8 contracts, I think it was, or 9 contracts this year, and in those contracts, one had the designer royalties at 6%. And I should note, again, this is the total percentage. Obviously, if it was co-design, it'd be split, but they would have offered the same percentage whether it was one designer or 2 designers. So yes, one contract was 6%, one contract was 7%, and the rest was at 8%. And this is of the total sales from the publisher side. So if that publisher will sell the games to a distributor, you're getting 8% of the distributor price effectively. If they sell it on Kickstarter, you're getting 8% of the pledge. Like they usually take out Kickstarter fees and any shipping first, but then you get 8% of that. So obviously, if something is Kickstarted, you're getting usually a higher dollar amount because it's distributor cost is usually like about 40% of MSRP. But that's kind of how it works out. And thankfully, in more and more contracts, publishers are being better at really specifying things like crowdfunding and how that can affect royalties, and which is important.
Okay. And so a lot of times people don't know what to ask. Like I've had the advice independently of someone getting 5% and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a slightly contentious topic. I even, I talk to publishers and we disagree. I think this is my experience. I mean, I'm a bit lucky in the sense that I work with publishers from all around the world, and definitely in the US, at least my perception is that US publishers generally still have this 5% rule in their head. And that is much more common. And that spreads, of course, to the designer community as well, because they work with those publishers.
Sure.
And there is a difference that when I work with European publishers, there's not that preconception. Now, that's not to say that European publishers don't offer 5%. Sometimes they do. But it's just that there's not this like, it's definitely 5%. And it seems like a much easier conversation. And that it's anecdotal. I haven't worked with absolutely every publisher, and there are certainly some North American publishers who are, giving royalties much higher than 5%. But I think that especially if it's crowdfunded, I think that is also a reason that the percentages should be higher, because there is less risk for the publisher that there is in the traditional. So they should be able to share some of those profits like slightly more evenly with the designer. And I think honestly, like if I was just to say to a designer, just ask for 6% if possible. I think like for me, and I said in the thread, I think 6% should be the new minimum. But again, there are other details which can change that. Sometimes there's an IP involved. Sometimes there's different manufacturing processes. Also, I tend to give smaller publishers, like if the publisher is smaller, it's like their first or second game, it's a different process as to working with a much more established publisher who, like if they have cash flow problems, for a small publisher is a lot different than it is for a larger publisher. So I kind of give the smaller publishers maybe a little bit more room to, I'm not as, I don't really think I'm demanding, but I think it's just, I mean, that's part of the reason of trying to share these numbers, is to have a conversation around it. And so people could go like, oh, actually, this person is getting royalty rates of X, Y, and Z. So why can't I ask for that? And I should also note, I don't think I'm getting these rates because like I'm Matthew Dunstan, I'm some famous designer. My name does not sell boxes. So
didn't even know that you had designed a
yes,
game I like.
But no, it's just to say that don't feel like oh, that guy's well established, whatever. That's not. I don't think that's. For some of these publishers, I haven't have to ask for 8%. That's their first offer, and that's a standard thing. So
nice. I mean, I really want to have this conversation. I'm a union person. I used to do union organizing in the way back time, and there's always this stigma to ask, right? And it's like on one hand, they don't want to look greedy, right? On the other hand, they don't want a publisher to label them as greedy. So like there's like, inner stigma and outer stigma that you risk by quote unquote asking for too much. And, so if an industry standard is 5% here in America, as you say, then I think there is a reticence to ask for more, because then it's like, oh, well, are you better than these other people? And this like fraught emotional experience happens. And meanwhile, like that's how you get change. That's how you're able to sustain a little bit more. And I think that, if you are a designer out there who's listening to the show and who wants to like really make a go of it and think that it can do a really good job and make a lot of people happy as a full-time designer, and there's this barrier though, that's over, because I'm not making enough, so to speak, then we're trying, I guess one of the functions of the show is trying to give people the confidence to go for it. And, like continue conversations and make relationships and find out what is reasonable. Don't come in asking for 13, or something like that.
Yeah.
But here's a real way that you can advocate for yourself and make a little bit more.
Just further to those designers, I think there's a couple of places that they can look at, even use as a kind of a support for them asking. So Cardboard Edison publishes some great reviews. In fact, they ask designers to submit details of the contracts they've signed. They've just finished their last review, which was for the last 5 years, where they asked designers to anonymously put details of the contracts that they had signed. And they agglomerated that information and made a really great series of infographics. They're free to find. If you look up Cardboard Edison, you'll find the infographics. They're really great. And they show that, yes, there are a lot of things at 5%, but there are certainly a lot of contracts which are more than 5%. The other thing, and you were talking about unions, and in Germany, they have SAZ. I'm going to butcher it if I try and say it. It's like Spiel or Toren something. It's basically a game designers association. It's been going for about 30 years. And it is kind of close to a union in a way. They have an English-speaking kind of like branch, or like that you could be part of it no matter where you live in the world. That's also something for the younger designers to look at. They help looking at contracts. I think they offer like free consultations in terms of, if you've got a contract from a publisher, you can show it to them and they can, give you some advice about that. They have a lawyer. It's a little bit tricky depending on which country you're in, because obviously laws are a bit different, but there are some general principles that are always the same. They also have like some really great draft contracts, which you can kind of compare and like see like what are some standard clauses. Like, so we're not going to get into now, but there's a lot of other things outside of just a base royalty rate that you should be making sure that you have like protections for yourself as a designer. Like what happens if the publisher goes out of business, or what if they never sell the game, this kind of thing.
Right. What if the check bounces?
Yeah. There's a lot of good resources out there. And I think that, again, that can help you give a little bit more, a little bit more weight to what you're saying. And the final thing I'll say, which is, especially if you're a designer, I don't think you would know this, but when a publisher, in my opinion, when a publisher makes an offer for your game, they've already invested a certain amount of time in that game. They've play tested it. They've usually maybe showed it to other people at the company. They've maybe even thought about art and things like that. The moment they make that offer, they are already invested in the game. That is your point. It is a negotiation, and that's perfectly reasonable. And that is business. This is a business decision. But don't feel that if you ask for something, the worst they can do is no, and that can happen. I mean, that doesn't always happen. But don't think that they're going to turn around and go like, well, we don't want to work with this person, we're going to rescind the offer. I think sometimes there is a little bit of fear.
They ask for this extra thing? Yeah.
Exactly, because that's not in their interest either. Like they if they don't want to do it, they will say no, but they're not going to go like further and go like, oh, well, we're going to rescind the offer altogether, because that doesn't make sense for them either, because they want to publish the game. And they've already invested time. And if it's just a negotiation, which is, again, like not that much effort for them to do the negotiation. So I would just, don't feel that, and I've never had an interaction with a publisher, including, earlier in my career when I maybe wasn't as known or whatever, where anyone has behaved remotely like that,
Okay.
And
great.
I regularly ask sometimes I have asked for royalty increases. I usually ask for more copies of my game. So, you usually promised a certain number of games, author copies effectively. Often I ask for double what they put in the contract, just because I like to be able to give them to, especially the people who playtest the game. I like to have enough that I don't feel like I have to ration it out amongst people. Again, there's always, not always possible. And sometimes, if it's a big, huge Kickstarter, I don't get like hundreds of copies of them, because that doesn't make any sense. But again, like people are usually very reasonable. It's okay to negotiate at that point. It's not going to dissuade them from working with you. The worst they can do is to say no. But yes, you could at least ask the question, which is a good step to start to hopefully raise the minimum floor for everybody.
Absolutely. So very quickly before I go on to advances, you mentioned author copies. So then what's a good number there?
Yes, I think usually, basically it depends on like how many they put in a case sometimes. Usually the number is between 6 to 12, I would say. And I think asking for 12 is perfect. Felt like 10 or 12 is reasonable, but it's like 6 is a minimum, I think. Again, this kind of scales a little bit depending on the size of the game. If it's a really tiny game, obviously it's a little bit easier to get more copies. If it's a huge game, maybe you're only going to get 4 or 5 because it's just more expensive to make. I think that's okay. The other thing to kind of with author copies is foreign language editions can be another thing. You can specify in the contract that you want a copy of each foreign language edition. It's not always going to happen, and it's not something I necessarily think of as essential, but it's certainly reasonable to ask, and a lot of publishers are more than happy to do that. And again, like if you haven't made a lot of games, if this is your one game that you've made, it can be nice to see all the different editions in different languages around the world. So that's also something to ask for
Nice.
as well.
So let's get to advances. I've mentioned them a couple of times. That's a pretty important part of the process, especially for a newer designer starting out, because they might not like that advance can do some things. Like it can help, pay for a project that didn't work out along the line. Like it really cushions the runway a little bit. So, how do advances work? Is that a normal thing? Does every design have an advance in there? What's a good number for it? Break it all down.
Yeah, so I do actually have a slide for this for the podcast viewers. So again, it was about 10,000 euros from 9 games from the last year, and most of those were co-designed. In terms of advances, so for those who don't know, advances are the payment you get upon signing the contract. They're an advance on royalties, so they'll be, if you would be paid royalties later, then the advance will be subtracted from those royalties before you get paid over that. But they're to essentially protect the designer, especially if the game is never made after you sign it. So it's essentially paying you something back for the time for the design before it's actually manufactured, because obviously there's usually at least a year, if not more, from the point of signing to the game actually being released. And I should say also, it's a year maybe until the game's published, but then it's maybe even another year until you get paid royalties, because obviously you're only going to get paid royalties after the fact, after they've got sold, and sometimes that only happens once a year, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this is total advances. So this would be, if you were a solo designer, you would get this 100%. These numbers, I'm getting 50% of these numbers. They range from about 1,000 euros, which I think is like 1,100 US dollars or something like that. I think it's like an extra 10% in US dollars. And the rest was somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 euros. So somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 US dollars. Again, and this is sort of total advance amounts. I should say most of these games are slightly bigger games. I think one thing that does affect the advances is it depends on like what the expected royalty rate is going to be. If it's a game that's selling for more, it's expected if you make the same number of copies, then the actual like base amount of money you make from the royalties is greater. So, it does scale a little bit. I think, in my opinion, somewhere around like £500 is a good minimum amount. So that would be about 600, or 500 USD is also fine. In terms of, I think, what the absolute minimum is in terms of a total advance that you should see in a contract, because the advance is not just a protection for you, but it's also a sign of the sort of the publisher's seriousness. That I said a little earlier about how they've already invested time, when they're thinking of signing a game, but once you sign it, the advance is in part them showing their seriousness about wanting to publish the game and having some skin in the game, because maybe something that's not talked about as much either is the fact that we think a lot about as designers and especially newer designers. It's like, I just want to sign my game. That's right. That's the pinnacle I have to reach. And yes, that is of course like the first thing that you have to do. But there are so many things that can go wrong in between signing a game that might not see, it might never actually get released. And in some ways, that's a much, much harder process to go through, because that can even be more disappointing. Of course, like you get very used to pitching games and then being, not interested in it. But
right.
And you want as much stuff in the contract, which sort of protects you for that. And advances are, again, one of the most important things. And actually this year, I think either 2 or 3 of the games which have been included in these advanced royalties are in fact games that were either already released from other publishers in the past, or games that had been previously signed with a publisher but were never released. So in some ways, actually, this is the second time I'm getting paid for some of these games. Now, of course, if you were to do an actual like rate per year, it's terrible, because some of these games have been. There was one of the games that I re-signed that had been sitting with a publisher for 4 years or something. So yes, I'm getting an extra 1,000 euros now, but it hasn't done anything for 5 years. So it's not exactly a great rate, but at least I did get something out of that. It wasn't completely zero, and that's why advances are extremely important, and having that minimum amount, and really making sure that you ask for that, make sure that's in the contract, definitely, but make sure that it's clear about the amount and clear about how that's going to be paid, and the time frame on that.
Mhm. And that's also a little bit of an emotional thing. You're asking for a publisher to hand over money that they haven't made on the game, in a sense. And royalties are a little bit more safer for them because like they've already had the sales, and it's like, okay, here's a section of what you're doing. So like that can also be, I imagine anyway, as a designer asking for X amount, that could be a little bit of an emotional thing for them. It's like, okay, you're basically asking to pay them for work that hasn't been done yet. So
Sure, but I think the thing to yeah, I completely agree with that, and I'd say that we have to normalize the point is that is like the cost of doing business if you're a publisher. Like if you want to sign a game, part of that cost is paying in advance. Just much like you may have paid a lawyer to draw up the contracts originally. Which is another cost, which that is it is not. I'm saying a lot of things, I guess, in a very confident way. I'm not a publisher, so one day it would be good, have a publisher
yeah.
on it. I don't want to be too strident, but I don't think it's acceptable for a publisher to come back and say we can't pay advance. Maybe it might be smaller than what you want. Maybe like in the absolute worst instance, something like $250. Again, I think it depends on the publisher. Definitely smaller, younger publishers, it is much harder to give a lot of money upfront because for them, cash flow is even more important. And I think that's where you have to adjust your expectations. But the presence of an advance, like of an amount, is just it should be standard. And unfortunately, it's sort of in my mind it is standard. But of course, there are still some publishers who are not offering it, and I think that should not happen anymore. Basically,
right. No, and we are trying. I mean, look, we are trying to push for change. That's just kind of the bottom line here.
Okay.
Okay, so then, so this has been really valuable information. I would like to wrap up with one last topic, which is kind of near to my heart as a person. You know my channel, and I do cultural criticisms of games and everything. So there's this like persistent question of like, why do we keep getting these crappy themes, colonialist themes, and the 18,000th Cthulhu game, and like the answer is in the finances. Like the answer is in like what you described of, okay, you need that evergreen. And I remember when you put this thread up on Meeple Syrup, or I think like Sen Foon Lim had relinked it. Someone had said, okay, this just tells me that I need to work on hits. And, if it's not going to be a hit, it's not worth my time. And that's kind of the conclusion that one might get from, this, like, I don't want to work on a game that has one print, 5,000 copies and done, that I'm not going to make a lot of money on that. I need to make sure it's a hit. And therefore, people know what sells, the familiar stuff, which kind of has some crappiness in it. So I guess break that down a little bit, that idea. And what is your approach? Like, how do you determine what you work on? That idea of like, I need a hit. How strong is that in the back of your mind? And how much does that pull you towards certain designs, certain themes over others?
It's a really great point and a great area too. And I saw that comment as well. I kind of disagree with that. I think, firstly, if everyone knew what a hit was when you started working on it, we'd all only be working on hits, and we would do that all the time. I'd never release a game that didn't. So, firstly, it's kind of impossible to work out what's going to be a hit, even if you put together, like, I'm going to put together the 5 best things that are selling right now, and that's going to sell like amazing. That doesn't guarantee anything. So, I think thinking that you can aim for hits, like aiming for the Spiel des Jahres, is similar. Like, you can't do that. I mean, that's something completely out of your control. And actually having a hit game is kind of out of your control as well. So from the designer point of view, I would say, and links back to what I said earlier, is I think releasing actually more games of various types, lots of different, I release games for different.
Get those darts going. Get those darts going.
Yes, exactly. And at different dartboards as well. So I release games for children. I release games, sort of heavier strategic games. I release narrative games, release cooperative games. We just did with Postmark Games, we're doing these print at home games that we did over on Kickstarter, which is just print at home, print and play kind of games. And those give you all those chances to get those hits, but you can control at least how many shots you're taking at the dartboard. You can't, to a certain degree, you can't, aim where they're going to let. All that being said, there are, of course, some things which are going to be inherently, for whatever reason, more niche than others in the kind of like general hobbyist space. I think my thing, I guess, is about product. And there are a lot of different things that go into games as a product. And that's going to ultimately determine, I think, in some way, how they sell. that is like theme and setting is a huge part of that. And I think in some ways, I hope it's very, very slowly changing. Like things like, for example, Wingspan doing very, very well, or I think the really great work from Flat Out Games, the designers of Point Salad and Calico and Cascadia, which has done amazingly well with, okay, we haven't fully shifted from the really traditional thing, but we're slightly moving in a different direction. Hopefully can show to publishers who are thinking, okay, I'm going to get a bit off the board. You could also say to designers, well, how about, you look at, I think actually one of the great things about Wingspan in this particular is that theme is baked so well into the game. It's not something you could have applied later. I think that hopefully gives inspiration to designers to feel like, oh, if I'm passionate about something and I can design a game that really marries that theme and that setting really well with what I'm doing in the game, that could be a successful package, even if that particular setting or theme hasn't been seen before or hasn't been popular before, because I think that actually the fit is really important rather than necessarily exactly what the actual theme is or what the actual setting is. So I think that's also something to think about. And the only other thing that is also coming up, and Cardboard Edison asked the question in their survey, it's the first time I've actually seen it, where they asked whether designers had in their contracts had a clause which gave them, oh no, actually I might have it slightly wrong, but it was basically they have some control over, this was about representation in the game, not necessarily specifically about setting or theme, but was there a clause in the contract where they, the publisher, either would let the designer have, would have to approve like the representation of people in the game and having a diverse representation, or some statement to the effect that, that there would be a diverse representation in the game. Please look at that. If you can link the Cardboard Edison thing, that'll be great, because I've forgotten the exact wording of it. But basically,
I might have them on the show at some point. I might reach out.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting, because I haven't seen it personally, and it's good because, again, like as we talking about things means you start thinking about them, and the fact that these clauses can be a thing is something that I will think about possibly having in contracts, which is, I would say, it's a difficult thing as if you think of it just from a purely legal point of view, because sometimes I'm not exactly sure how they would be worded to ensure that. But even having that conversation with a publisher when you're in the process of signing the game, I always think about that again, that negotiation period is not just about the actual details of the contract or the numbers. It's also about working out whether you want to work with that publisher. Like, do your values align with them? Does their vision for the game align with your vision for the game? That's not to say that you have to completely, that they have to completely agree with everything you want the game to be, but can they express their vision, and can you get on board with that vision, or at least work together to something? And similarly, do you agree with how they conduct business? And it's a bit of it's really, really hard as first-time designer, because you feel very much like you're not in a position of power at that point. But it is the best time, if any, again, because the publisher wants the game. So that's the time to ask the questions about, how do you view diverse, representation in your game? Do you have a diverse range of characters in your game? Maybe if you have an issue with something in their back catalog, or that concerns you, you might say, look, I know that I've seen your previous games done X, but actually for me, it would be really, really important. And I think it's important to have a more diverse representation. Have that conversation, even if it can't be an actual clause in the contract, which may be difficult for various reasons. At least you can have that conversation, and you can feel satisfied to go into that relationship effectively feeling like you're, everything kind of aligns. Which is also important.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about designers who have very strong convictions about representation, about different themes. Like Elizabeth Hargrave had a very strong conviction. She wasn't going to make the game about anything else. She actually describes how she kind of gave Wingspan, or not like offered Wingspan, like demoed Wingspan for people, and they were like, okay, we could change the theme over here, we'll publish it, or we'll work on it. And she's like, nope, we're going to find somebody that. So that takes a real thing, and that's a certain type of person. I guess, like, to speak to the person who, I don't know, like they want to publish their game. Like, at the end of the day, they just want to get their game published. And is it your experience that that you have met designers that do feel pulled towards these familiar, tried and true? Is that something that you've encountered, or is that maybe changing over the last little while?
No, definitely. Like you see a lot of the kind of generic, trading the Mediterranean fantasy. I was a judge on the Cardboard Edison competition last year, which is kind of maybe the first time I've kind of been on the other side of like kind of receiving pitches, I guess. And yeah, I was surprised of all the you do see the generic. I think from a designer point of view, I think part of that has to do with these themes are kind of they're flexible enough that they can support almost anything. And I think a lot of designers are kind of mechanisms led, or at least I don't know. I feel like the hobbyist designers that it pulls a little heavier. They're a little bit more strategic, a little bit more mechanical led. That's a complete generalization, but at least that's what I saw. And when you have this kind of mechanism you just want a game, setting to kind of support that. Mm-hmm. And it's also not as important to you. You're interested in how the game plays.
Yeah,
and
I want my role selection worker placement game with multiple paths to victory. I don't care if it has zombies or if it has trading or if it has all these other things.
Exactly. I guess the only thing I would say to those people, which I do understand, and I think all these things we're talking about, you do have to start somewhere. You kind of get better all the time. Just getting back to Elizabeth Hargrave and Wingspan, and again, why I in my opinion, why it's one of the reasons why it's sold so well. Use that as some inspiration to realize that even if the mechanisms of the game are really important, try and find something distinctive in a setting or theme, especially something that has not been seen before, and where you feel like, because there's no reason not to. You're not going to lose anything from your game. You're still going to get your great, the game you want. It can only do better, I think, in this. I think because there is slowly more and more appetite for a more diverse range of themes and representation in the market. That could be actually a selling factor. And in fact, it's not quite there. It's still a lot of work to go, but you could be a part of that kind of rising wave towards where sales start to reflect turning away from these, sort of old tired colonial themes. And the only other thing is they do kind of like blend together, I would say, a little bit, like if you want your game to stand out, when you've pitched it to, if a publisher's heard 30 pitches in a day, and this is the 15th trading in a Mediterranean game, even from just a very practical level, if you've come out with something really distinctive and new, then they're going to remember that, that's a good thing. And that will transfer to a consumer as well.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground and you have uncovered a lot of nuts and bolts. Thank you so much for breaking it down. So I think we're definitely going to kind of end that here, but I don't think this is going to be the end. I think that we can definitely, we have a lot of different topics to explore and the hobby's going to keep on growing. So absolutely, anytime you'd like to come back on the show to share some more industry insights, you are more than welcome. This has been amazing.
No, my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me on, Jason.
And Wise Goldfish on Twitter, if we wanted to reach out.
One word, Wise Goldfish. Yes, exactly.
One word, Wise Goldfish. And you have the adventure games. More adventure games are coming out.
So they've just released Grand Hotel Abaddon in English in the States, so you should be able to get that right now. And as I said, the Echo series for Ravensburger, the first two are the Dancer and the Cocktail. They're available right now as well. So.
And
yes more to come,
app-driven game and all sorts of stuff that's coming in the next year, so you are definitely going to be very busy, and hopefully this the full-time designer thing really works out. You're able to kind of ride this through for a long time.
I don't have to come back next year saying I'm now a part-time designer. Hopefully I keep going forward.
Went back to research assisting. All that stuff. Well, Matthew Dunstan, thank you so much. Please come back on the show anytime you want.
I will. Thank you again, Jason.
If you can change your mind, you can change the world, people. So until next time, later, everybody.
Bye.